Okay, this is part 31 of Rebel. Please make sure that you are liking the video and subscribing. Eden. Daniel's definition of a run, of course, is different from everyone else's. In all the years he spent darting across roofs and shimmying slick as oil between balconies and railings, he has never asked me to come with him or taught me how he does it, or even mentioned where he goes. The one time when I was 14 and tried to follow him up the side of a wall, I fell on my back and hit my tailbone hard enough to limp for several days. Where are we going? I ask him now as we head out of our complex. We're dressed in comfortable clothes, loose pants scrunched at the ankles, soft hooded jackets, shoes with good traction. Nervous energy buzzes in my head. Daniel doesn't seem bothered. He walks in front of me with the absolute assurance of someone who knows where he's going. His mess of blonde hair bounces with every step he takes. I try to keep pace with his strides. How well do you think you know the Lake District? He says to me over his shoulder. I shrug. It's hard to think about our old neighborhood when we're staying in the middle of this gem district. I remember our street, I reply. John's factory, Mom's workplace, the alley where we used to play street hockey. Why? In the night, shadows cut across Daniel's face and hide his expression from view. He casts me a sidelong glance as he turns us in the direction of the humbler districts. It's easy to see them from this hilltop view, the areas of the city where lights turn sparse. Just follow me, he says, turning into a narrow street that leads to a set of tracks. I figure it's time I show you what my memory of our past looks like. It's an old subway shop, the concrete thick with layers of graffiti. My brother nods down the track to where the first glimmers of a train's light flicker in the darkness. Keep close to me, he says. We're going to take it easy today, but over time I'll show you how I make my way through tougher areas of the city. Over time. You mean you're going to take me with you on some of your outings in Ross City? He gives me a brief smile as the subway pulls up to a stop. I'll think about it, he replies. If there's a Ross City to return to. Then he ushers us into the train and the glass doors close behind us. Half an hour later we emerge onto the cracked, humbled streets of Lake. I have a vague recollection of this intersection. It's where I used to walk through on my way to school, at least before everything happened. I look curiously on as Daniel walks up to the building wall of an alley and tests his boot against the crumbling brick. Then he steps back and points up to show me. See this? He says, touching the cracks in the brick. If you step up on something at this height, you should be able to grab onto the second floor's ledge. Before I can respond, he backs up a bit, then darts at the wall and kicks off against the brick. He reaches up and swings himself onto the ledge, then shimmies over to the closest balcony he sees. I look on, stunned, as he swings his legs over the balcony railings and then hops up to perch against them. Okay, I say, slowly eyeing the brick. Just give me a sec. On my first try, my boot slips against the brick and I fall on my back. It takes me 4 more tries before I finally grip on well enough to grab the second floor ledge. Then I pull myself up laboriously, inching carefully along the wall until I reach the balcony. Daniel grabs my arm and helps me climb over it. I eye him, waiting for him to scold me for being careless, for that worried light to appear in his eyes, but he just shrugs. The more you practice, the easier it'll get, he replies. If you end up in trouble in the Undercity again, you'll know how to make a quick escape. I look at him in surprise. You'd actually be okay with me going down to the Undercity by myself? He gives me a withering look. After everything we've already been through with Han, you wandering the Undercity sounds like daycare. He nods to the side of the building where a thick pair of cable crisscrosses between the alley's 2 buildings. Come on, I'll show you where I used to stay. I follow him gingerly onto the cables. He steps rapidly along them, as sure-footed as if he were walking on the street, where he used to stay. John always said you never strayed far from the house, I call to him as I try to keep my balance. I never told John about all the places I went, he replies. It was safer that way. Daniel waits patiently as I take a few extra steps to cross the wires. Then we make our way onto a flat rooftop and from there take a metal ladder up another floor. With each step we go deeper into the heart of Lake until I can see the vast, dark shoreline, the water lapping idly below us. I'm drenched in sweat by now and my breath comes shallow as I try to keep pace with Daniel. Finally he stops us on a street crowded with crooked sheds and shuttered stalls all closed for the night. I've never been this way before. Trash piles in heaps on the side of the streets and tattered clothes line the sides of each stall. It looks like some kind of marketplace. Daniel nods up at the second story of stalls stacked on top of the first. He points to an empty one, then the shadows behind it. I follow him up the side of the first floor stalls until our boots clang against the tin metal sheets of the roofs. The second level of stalls is low enough that we have to duck our heads. Daniel leads us into the shadows where the stalls are stacked against the wall. Here, the wall itself is crumbling away so that there are tiny concave pockets of loose brick hidden behind the second-story stalls, cloth drapes. It's just enough space for a person to curl up without being seen. Daniel crouches here for a moment, his eyes distant. His entire body is tense and his hands fiddle restlessly. He swallows hard. It looks like it's taking everything in him to be back here. When I first started roaming the streets, he says, I'd end up looking for these crumbling pockets in the markets. They were high and dry for the most part, and the street police wouldn't bother you if they did a sweep through the neighborhood. You could get a decent night's sleep, and no one would ever know you were there. I stare in disbelief at the tiny pocket of space. It's filthy and dark, littered with brick and dirt. You'd sleep here? I whisper. He nods. For years. It wasn't so bad. I liked that it was right in the markets. Made it easier to steal food. His lips have tightened now. I look at him, wondering what kind of effort it takes for him to dredge these memories up. He has never talked about the details of his street life with me before. I knew nothing about how he survived, what he had to do, where he had to live. Now I try to picture my brother, the legend of the Republic, the star of Ross City, curled into a tight ball in this pitiful place, scrounging for a meal. And I've never understood. I'd never bothered to understand his abhorrence for this kind of surrounding. He shakes his head at me, then starts climbing back down the side of the stalls. I follow him. He leads me to the back alleys behind the markets, pointing out the trash bins. They are overflowing with heaps of garbage piled around them. This hasn't changed much since I lived here, he tells me as we walk. Another place you could get food, albeit during more desperate nights. Sometimes Tess and I would camp in alleys like this one. The street police only did their sweeps through here every other night, Lack of funding and manpower. He pauses at the end of the alley, then points out to the water. See that? He says. I look closely. Rising out of the water some 50 yards from the shoreline is an old abandoned skyscraper, hollowed out and long gutted for parts, its skeleton towering dark and foreboding against the night. These structures litter the entire lake. Daniel hops onto the end of a dilapidated, abandoned pier leading out into the water. He nods for me to follow. I do. Together we make our way along the pier's rotting floorboards, hopping over parts where it's all caved into the lake. As we reach the end of it, Daniel jumps onto the lowest floor of the skyscraper, rising out of the water. I take a running start, then collapse to my knees beside him. He gives me a grim smile as we settle against the edge of the building. John always told us you had to stay away from the lake when we were kids, I finally say through my gasps of breath. He said these skyscrapers were full of dangerous folk. Daniel nods. He wasn't wrong. You had to be careful which towers you chose to stay in, which floors you ventured on. Gangs would rotate in and out of these structures. I had to make sure I stayed out of their way and remembered what the schedules were, but it's the nicest place that me and Tess were able to find. Whenever we had a chance to stay on these towers on the lake, we considered that a lucky day. A stone sinks to the bottom of my chest. I'd always known, to some extent, why he's never told me his stories, why he doesn't seem like he wants to remember our home, or seems too eager to stay in the sky floors of Ross City. I knew, and yet I didn't know it all. I've never walked these streets like he has, never understood what he faced out here every day, a child with a family he could never contact. He was always drawn to the humble streets of Lake, always despised the luxurious ignorance of our current home, but I never had to fend for myself in Lake either. The screaming, the blur of soldiers in our home, the sound of a shot to our mother's head, the past crowds into my head, loud and relentless. Daniel watches me quietly. What he sees in my expression he doesn't say, but after a while he looks away and leans back on one arm. How much do you remember of John? He asks. An old rusty memory appears of Daniel and me waiting around our dining table, impatient for John to come home from his work shift so that we could eat. My oldest brother's weary smile, his cheeks still red from heat and exhaustion, his arms outstretched as I dash from the table to greet him. Enough nights pass now that I forget what we had. Enough nights pass now when I forget that we had another brother. The realization makes me flush with shame. Not as much as I wish I did, I reply. Daniel smiles. John was the one who taught me how to change your diapers, you know? Now it's my turn to smile. That's not where I thought this conversation would go. Who do you think was in charge of you as a baby when Mom had to work late shifts? Daniel raises an eyebrow at me. John would drag me over to the table where he'd change you, and the two of us would hover over you, arguing about the best way to pin a fresh cloth diaper on you while you screamed your head off. It was the worst gaudy chore in the world. He taught me how to put you to sleep and how to tell if you were sick. I almost burned down our house once when I was trying to boil you some mashed carrots. John almost killed me for that one. I try to picture two young boys bickering with each other while an infant version of me looked on. I try to imagine Daniel frantically putting out a kitchen fire while John watched in horror. The thought is so ridiculous that I can't help a laugh from escaping my throat. Daniel laughs once too and shakes his head. I used to fight with him even more than I do with you. Everything was a battle. He hated how impulsive I was, how sometimes I'd stand in the street and complain about the police loud enough for everyone to hear, how many questions I'd asked about why Republic soldiers had roughed up our father or where he'd gone. I lost count of the number of times he had to drag me home after I'd gotten in some argument about Republic history with the kids at school. He was convinced I'd get myself killed someday with my carelessness and that you'd pick up my bad habits. He sighs. I guess he wasn't wrong. A breeze sweeps past us, bringing with it the scent of a lake night, fried street food, smoke, briny water. I cross my legs and try to ignore the sudden lump that rises in my throat. I should have listened to you, I finally say, my voice so quiet that I can barely hear myself. I couldn't protect you any more than John could protect me. You've seen the wrong in this world, powerful forces that no brother could ever hope to hide from you. And no matter what John did, or what I do, those things stay with us forever. I start shaking my head. John shouldn't have had that burden. You shouldn't have. Keeping you from the truth of the world only made it worse for you. Daniel gives me a sad smile. This place was your home too. Every single one of these rotting streets, these back alleys. This is where we were all raised, yeah? But I'm so afraid of this place, Eden. I'm afraid, even now. I wanted to hide it from you, like somehow that would keep you from being drawn back to it, so that you'd never have to know what it was like. He shakes his head and stares out at the water. Like somehow us leaving this all behind meant that it didn't exist anymore. I look out into the darkness, the voices crowding in my head. As always, I can feel myself pulling away, trying to shield the jumbled mess in my mind from Daniel, to turn it inward and let it churn there until it all fades again into the background. But it doesn't fade. Daniel's looking at me now, and I realize it's because there are tears streaming down my cheeks. I hadn't even noticed when I started crying. Embarrassed, I wipe them angrily away and try to force myself back into a state of calm. But the tears keep coming. I can't stop them. Daniel reaches out and seizes both of my wrists in his hands. Look at me, he says, his eyes locking onto mine. They are fierce in the night, and in them I see the same brother who had once stood up to an entire nation. It is not weakness to open your heart. It does not make you less of a man to ask for help, to turn to someone when you're vulnerable, to need a shoulder to cry on. You don't have to bear the weight of anything by yourself. Do you understand me? I know what it's like to be forced to go it alone. I never want you to feel that way. I find myself nodding through my tears, wishing I could have turned to him sooner, wishing I could be more like him in every way. I see them every night, I say to him, my words breaking. They're there every time I close my eyes. I jump at every sound. I see a soldier in every person standing at a corner. I thought if I could just drown it all out in the Undercity, if I could replace it with something else so loud and overwhelming that it might go away. I thought if I could just see the Republic again, return home and understand my past. The pain in Daniel's eyes is raw and real. The fear of this was what had kept me silent for so long. He nods once, his hands firmly on my shoulders. I see them too. He replies quietly. I should have talked to you about my nightmares. I can't expect you to open up to me if I don't do the same. I nod again. I'm sorry, don't be. His eyes soften and he pulls me into a hug. You didn't do anything wrong. It is his embrace that finally breaks my last barrier. I cry and cry and cry. I cry because I never let myself truly understand my own brother, because I'd never understood myself. I cry for all the lives that our past have set on different paths, for June's loss of her family, for Tessa's loss of her childhood, for Daniel becoming a parent when he was himself just a boy. I cry because I'm grateful that we still, in spite of everything, have all found each other, because sometimes broken pieces find a way to make a new whole.